When Nurse Maya Rostova dropped a heavy metal tray on the clinic floor, everyone jumped. Everyone, except the decorated Navy SEAL sitting in the corner. Captain Gideon Cross didn't even blink. It was a biological impossibility for a Tier 1 operator not to react to a sudden, loud noise. But then, Maya looked under the waiting room table. His 10-year-old son, Sam, frantically reached out and tapped his father's knee twice. Instantly, Gideon turned. That is when Maya realized the heartbreaking truth. The fierce, impenetrable soldier was completely deaf, and his terrified little boy was secretly acting as his ears, so his family wouldn't be torn apart. Maya Rostova knew how to read a room. Working as a clinical audiology nurse for the Department of Defense meant she saw a lot of men who did not want to be there. Captain Gideon Cross was exactly that type. He sat in the waiting room chair with the rigid posture of a man preparing for an ambush. He was 38, broad-shouldered, weathered. A pair of dark aviator sunglasses hung loosely from the collar of his shirt. Next to him sat his son, Sam, 10 years old. The boy wasn't looking at a phone. He wasn't reading a book. He sat on the absolute edge of his seat, scanning the room with a tense, exhausting vigilance. Maya stood behind the reception counter, reviewing Gideon's file. Routine fitness for duty, medical clearance. Nothing unusual on paper, but something about the space between the father and son felt heavy. Maya turned to file the chart. As she did, her elbow caught the edge of a stainless steel instrument tray resting on the counter. It slipped. It crashed onto the hard linoleum floor. The sound was sharp and piercing, like a gunshot in the quiet clinic. The receptionist gasped. An older patient in the corner spilled his coffee. Maya flinched, immediately looking up to apologize. But her eyes landed on Gideon Cross. He had not moved. He had not blinked. His breathing hadn't hitched. His broad shoulders hadn't tensed. It was a biological impossibility. Even the most hardened Tier 1 operator possesses a baseline startle reflex to sudden, sharp noises directly behind them. Then, Maya saw the boy. Underneath the low coffee table, partially hidden from the rest of the room, Sam's small hand shot out. He tapped his father's left knee. Twice. Fast. Instantly, Gideon turned his head. He looked down at the fallen metal tray, then up at Maya. His face arranged itself into a mask of mild, measured annoyance. "Careful," Gideon said. His voice was deep, steady, and perfectly modulated. Maya stared at the man. Then she looked down at the 10-year-old boy. Sam's hand was shaking slightly as he pulled it back to his lap. He looked exhausted. The boy wasn't just sitting with his father. He was standing guard. The decorated Navy SEAL was deaf, and his 10-year-old son was his ears. "Captain Cross," Maya said, stepping into the waiting area. "Room 3, please." Gideon stood. He moved with the fluid, calculated grace of a man who had spent 2 decades in combat zones. But as he walked past her, Maya noticed something else. His eyes never left her face. Inside the small examination room, Gideon took a seat on the edge of the medical table. Sam sat in the plastic visitor's chair in the corner. The boy's posture was identical to his father's, spine straight, hands folded in his lap. But the 10-year-old's eyes darted around the room, mapping the environment with unnatural anxiety. Maya picked up her tablet. "I just have a few standard intake questions before we do the audiometry test, Captain." "Go ahead," Gideon said. He took the aviator sunglasses off his collar and held them in his left hand. It looked like a casual military posture, but Maya realized it was an anchor. It gave him an excuse to keep his head perfectly still, angled directly at her, more specifically, at her mouth. "Any recent changes in your vision or balance?" she asked, speaking at a normal conversational volume. "No," he replied instantly. "Any tinnitus? Ringing in the ears?" "No." He was an expert lip reader, the best she had ever seen. If she hadn't dropped that metal tray, she might never have suspected a thing. He had trained himself to read the micro movements of a speaker's jaw with absolute precision. But Maya was a clinical nurse. She didn't guess. She verified. "All right," Maya said, setting the tablet down. "I'm going to wash my hands and we'll get started." She stepped across the room to the sink. She turned the water on, keeping it at a very low trickle. Then, she deliberately turned her back to Gideon. "Captain, have you experienced any recent blunt force trauma to the head?" she asked, keeping her voice perfectly clear but facing the tiled wall. Behind her, there was nothing but silence. 3 seconds passed. 5 seconds. Maya glanced at the polished metal cover of the paper towel dispenser. In the distorted reflection, she saw Gideon leaning forward. His brow was furrowed, his eyes scanning the back of her head, completely lost. And in the corner of the room, Sam was frantically forming letters with his hands, signing the words she had just spoken so his father could understand. Maya slowly turned the water off and faced them. Gideon's jaw immediately tightened. He leaned back. "The water," he said smoothly. "I couldn't hear you over the running water." It was a good lie. A practiced, desperate lie. But Maya didn't look at him. She looked at the boy, whose small hands were still frozen in midair. She didn't type anything into her tablet. She just looked back at Gideon. The proud, decorated Navy SEAL was fighting a war he had already lost, and he was forcing his son to fight it with him. Maya didn't stop them from leaving the exam room. She watched Gideon practically march his son out of the clinic, moving with the hasty precision of a man escaping enemy territory. She gave them a 2-minute head start. Then she followed. The midday sun was blinding in the asphalt parking lot. Gideon was already at his black truck, opening the passenger door for Sam. "Captain Cross," Maya called out. Gideon didn't turn. He couldn't hear her. She walked faster, stepping into his peripheral vision. Only then did he stop, his hand resting heavy on the truck door. The aviator sunglasses were firmly back on his face, hiding his eyes. "The appointment is over, Nurse Rostova," he said flatly. "You failed the exam, Captain. You didn't run the audiometry test." "I didn't have to," Maya said, her voice steady. "You have profound hearing loss. You're reading my lips. And when you can't, your son is signing for you." Gideon's jaw clenched, his broad shoulders squared, a physical wall of intimidation. "Watch yourself. You don't know what you're talking about." "I know that putting a 10-year-old child in a state of hypervigilance to act as your covert translator is psychological abuse," Maya fired back, refusing to back down. "Don't you dare." "Please." A small, fractured voice interrupted. Maya looked down. Sam had scrambled out of the truck. He wedged himself between Maya and his father, his small hands raised defensively. Tears were already spilling down his pale cheeks. "Please don't tell them," Sam begged, his voice trembling. "If you tell the Navy, he loses his job. If he loses his job, the judge will make me go live with Mom." Gideon reached down, gently pulling the boy against his leg. "Sam, stop." "She doesn't want me. She just wants the military checks," Sam cried, looking desperately at Maya. "I don't mind helping him, I promise. Just don't take him away from me." Maya stared at the child. He was trembling violently. The heavy bags under his eyes weren't just from boredom, they were from terror. She looked up at Gideon. The impenetrable SEAL had closed his eyes. The defiance was gone, replaced by a suffocating, silent shame. The house was completely silent. For a man who had lost his hearing, the silence shouldn't have felt any different. But tonight, it was suffocating. Gideon sat at his kitchen table in the dark. A single glass of water sat untouched in front of him. Upstairs, Sam was finally asleep. The boy had cried himself to exhaustion after they got home from the clinic. Gideon rubbed his face with his heavy, scarred hands. He had survived ambushes. He had survived shrapnel. But seeing his 10-year-old son beg a stranger to keep their family together had broken him in a way the military never could. At 9:14 p.m., the screen of his phone lit up on the table. Motion detected at front porch. Gideon frowned. He stood, his muscles automatically tensing into a combat-ready posture. He walked down the dark hallway and pulled open the heavy oak door. Maya Rostova stood on his welcome mat. She was out of her scrubs, wearing a simple tan trench coat against the evening chill. Gideon stared at her mouth, waiting for the killing blow. "Did you come to deliver the failure notice in person?" he asked, his voice a low, defensive gravel. He kept his hand on the door, ready to shut it. "No," Maya said. Her lips moved slowly, deliberately, making sure he caught every word in the dim porch light. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a thick, heavy book. She held it out to him. Gideon looked down. It was a comprehensive textbook on American Sign Language. He didn't take it. He looked back up at her, his jaw tight. "What is this?" "It's a way out," Maya said evenly. "You are a highly decorated soldier, Captain, but right now you are being a terrible father. You are drowning, and you are using your 10-year-old son as a life raft." Gideon flinched. The words hit harder than physical blows because they were true. "I didn't file the medical report," Maya continued, stepping slightly closer. The cold night air drifted into the hallway. And I'm not going to. But you are going to learn how to communicate properly without forcing Sam to be your ears. Gideon looked at the book. Then he looked at the quiet, unyielding determination in her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, the hardened seal didn't know how to fight back. Why are you doing this? He asked softly. Because nobody should have to fight a war alone, Maya said. Are you going to let me in, Gideon, or are we going to do this on the porch? Gideon hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. Maya took off her trench coat, draping it over the back of a wooden dining chair. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and opened the heavy book. For the first 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of thick paper pages. Gideon was a Tier 1 operator. He could strip and reassemble a rifle in total darkness in under 40 seconds. His hands were built for violence, precision, and survival. But right now, trying to form the delicate, specific finger postures of the ASL alphabet, he looked entirely lost. Your thumb goes across the knuckles, not under them, Maya said quietly. She made sure she was facing him directly in the warm overhead light so he could read her lips. Try the letter E again. Gideon clenched his jaw. He raised his right hand, heavily scarred across the knuckles, and tried to fold his fingers down. It was stiff, awkward. He let out a low, frustrated breath and dropped his hand to the table. This is ridiculous, he muttered, looking away. It's only ridiculous because you aren't immediately perfect at it, Maya replied. He snapped his gaze back to her mouth, his pride stinging. My hands don't move like that. They will. Muscle memory takes time. Maya didn't offer him a soft, pitying smile. She offered him exactly what he needed. Calm, clinical patience. She reached across the wooden table. Gideon froze. Gently, Maya took his large, calloused hand in hers. Her fingers were cool, steady. She didn't hesitate or flinch at the rough texture of his scars. Relax your palm, she instructed, her voice dropping to a softer register. Don't fight the movement. Slowly, using her own fingers, she guided his thumb into the correct position across his knuckles. Gideon wasn't looking at his hand, he was looking at her. For a man who had spent the last 2 years building impenetrable walls to keep the world out, the simple, quiet pressure of her hands on his felt like an earthquake. There, Maya whispered, holding his hand in the correct shape. You just said your first letter. By the second week of lessons, the heavy, suffocating tension in the Cross household had begun to shift. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. Maya sat across from Gideon at the kitchen table, running through basic conversational signs. In the adjacent living room, Sam was curled up on the sofa, ostensibly reading a comic book. But Maya knew the boy wasn't reading, he was watching them. For the past 2 years, Sam had lived in a constant state of tactical alert. If a floorboard creaked, if a siren wailed in the distance, if a timer went off in the kitchen, Sam was the one who had to bridge the gap between the hearing world and his father. Suddenly, Maya's cell phone vibrated loudly against the wooden table. In the living room, Sam instantly dropped his comic book. He scrambled to sit up, his small hands already raising to sign the alert to his dad. But Maya was faster. She didn't look at Sam. She kept her eyes on Gideon, tapped her phone, and smoothly signed the word Times phone. Gideon read the sign. He didn't tense. He simply nodded and signed back, understand. Maya casually silenced the device and moved on to the next vocabulary word. On the sofa, Sam froze. His hands slowly lowered to his lap. He looked at Maya. Then he looked at his father, who was calmly practicing his alphabet, completely unbothered by the missed sound. Sam didn't have to translate. The alarm had sounded, and the adults had handled it. Maya watched out of the corner of her eye as the boy's rigid posture slowly collapsed. His small shoulders dropped. He sank deeper into the cushions. 10 minutes later, the comic book slipped from his fingers, falling quietly to the rug. Gideon noticed the movement. He stood up from the table and walked quietly into the living room. Maya followed. Sam was fast asleep. His breathing was deep and even. The tight, anxious pinch between his brows was gone. He hasn't slept in this room in 2 years, Gideon whispered, his voice thick with sudden emotion. He stared down at his son. He usually sits by the front window, watching the street. He doesn't have to stand guard anymore, Gideon, Maya said softly, standing beside him. He knows someone else is on watch. Gideon closed his eyes, the crushing weight of his own failure hitting him all at once. Gideon carefully draped a knitted blanket over his sleeping son. He stood over the sofa for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest, before quietly walking back into the kitchen. Maya was still sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The overhead light cast long, quiet shadows across the room. Gideon sat down heavily opposite her. He stared at his own scarred hands resting on the wood. "It was an IED in Helmand," he said. His voice was a low, rough gravel in the quiet house. He didn't look up, knowing he wouldn't be able to hear her response, but needing to say the words anyway. "We were clearing a compound. A local kid, maybe 7 years old, ran out from an alleyway right over a pressure plate. I lunged to tackle him behind a mud wall." Gideon swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as the ghost of the memory washed over him. "The blast threw us 20 feet. The kid survived without a scratch. But my helmet took the brunt of the shock wave. My eardrums ruptured instantly. The doctors said the nerve damage was permanent and progressive. For the last 2 years, it's just been slowly fading to black." Maya watched him carefully, making sure he looked up at her face before she spoke. "Why hide it, Gideon? The Navy has medical retirement. You earned an honorable discharge." "Because of Elena," Gideon said, his eyes darkening with a raw, desperate fear. "My ex-wife. When we split, she told me that the only thing I was good for was a military paycheck. She said if I ever lost my rank, I'd just be a broken, useless liability." He leaned forward, the impenetrable SEAL commander completely stripped of his armor. "If the medical board discharges me for being deaf, her lawyers will use it to prove I'm physically unfit to raise a child. She doesn't want Sam. She wants the DoD dependency money. If I lose my trident, I lose my son." Maya's heart ached at the sheer terror in the hardened soldier's eyes. She didn't offer him pity. She leaned across the table, ensuring he could read every single syllable on her lips. "You saved a child's life in that desert," Maya said fiercely, "and you have spent 2 years breaking yourself in half to protect your own. You are not a liability, Gideon. You don't need a uniform to be a hero. Sam just needs his dad." Gideon stared at her mouth, absorbing the words. For the first time in a very long time, he let himself believe them. The fragile peace in the cross house shattered on a Saturday afternoon. Maya was sitting on the living room rug with Sam, showing him how to sign the names of his favorite comic book characters when the heavy brass knocker on the front door clanged twice. Sam froze. The color instantly drained from his face. "It's Mom," he whispered, his hands dropping to his sides. Gideon emerged from the kitchen. His jaw was set like granite. He motioned for Maya to stay in the living room and walked to the entryway. When he opened the door, Elena stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She was sharply dressed in a tailored wool coat, her eyes immediately sweeping the house like a tactical drone scanning for weaknesses. "I was in the neighborhood," Elena said smoothly, though her gaze had already locked onto Maya. "I didn't realize you were entertaining, Gideon. Who is this?" Maya stood up, maintaining a calm, professional posture. "Maya Rostova. I'm a colleague." "A colleague," Elena repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noted Maya's practical clothes and steady demeanor. "From the naval base?" "From the clinical annex," Maya replied vaguely. Elena hummed, stepping past Gideon toward the kitchen. As she walked away, turning her back entirely to her ex-husband, she lowered her voice to a quiet, conversational murmur. "My lawyer filed a motion this morning, Gideon. We're going for full custody. I'm taking Sam to California next month." Gideon didn't move. He hadn't heard a single syllable. He was looking at the back of her head, completely unaware of the bomb she had just dropped. But Maya heard it, and Maya saw Elena glancing at Gideon's reflection in the hallway mirror, watching for his reaction. It was a trap. Without hesitating, Maya dropped a heavy hardcover book onto the coffee table. "To det." Gideon's eyes snapped to Maya. Maya looked directly at him, forming the words perfectly with her lips. "She wants full custody. California." Gideon's posture instantly shifted from rigid stillness to lethal focus. He stepped forward. "You aren't taking him anywhere, Elena." Gideon's voice boomed through the hallway, cold and absolute. "Check the divorce decree. You try to move him out of state, and I'll bury you in court." Elena turned around. She looked surprised, but the suspicion in her eyes didn't fade. She looked closely at Maya, then back at Gideon. We'll see, Elena said quietly. She walked back to the front door, stopping just briefly next to Maya. Rostova. I'll have to remember that name. When the door clicked shut, the silence in the house felt like a ticking clock. Elena Cross did not make idle threats. She operated with the ruthless, calculated efficiency of a sniper. On Wednesday morning, a man in a cheap gray suit walked into the DoD clinical annex. He didn't check in at the reception desk. He walked directly to Maya, confirmed her name, and handed her a thick manila envelope. It was a subpoena from the state family court. Maya sat in her small office, staring at the heavy legal text. Elena's legal team had filed an emergency motion for a change in custody, citing severe medical unfitness. The subpoena demanded Maya's mandatory appearance as a medical witness. It also demanded the immediate release of Captain Gideon Cross's audiometry evaluation. The trap was perfect. Maya had never filed the failure report. She had deliberately left Gideon's medical file marked as times pending further testing. But in a courtroom, under oath, pending wouldn't save him. If she took the stand and testified that his hearing was intact, Elena's lawyers would demand an independent medical exam. When the lie was exposed, Maya would be charged with perjury and medical fraud. She would lose her nursing license. She would face federal prison. If she told the truth, Elena would take Sam to California forever. That evening, Maya drove to Gideon's house. She didn't bother waiting for him to read her lips. She simply slid the manila envelope across the kitchen table. Gideon opened it. He read the first page. His calloused fingers gripped the edges of the paper so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't look angry. He looked devastated. "They're going to put you on the stand," Gideon said, his voice dangerously quiet. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "If you lie for me, they will strip your license. They will destroy your life." "I am well aware of the penalties, Gideon," Maya said evenly. "We can fight this. We just need to—" "No," Gideon interrupted. He stood up abruptly, the wooden chair scraping violently against the floor. "There is no we in a federal courtroom, Maya." The hardened seal stared at the subpoena. For the first time, he realized that in his desperate attempt to save his son, he had put an innocent woman directly in the line of fire. "Gideon, listen to me," Maya said, stepping around the kitchen table to force him to look at her. "There are legal avenues. We can request a medical deferment, or I can testify about your ASL proficiency." "Stop." Gideon's voice was like cracking ice. He didn't yell, but the absolute command in his tone brought the room to a dead halt. He picked up the manila envelope and shoved it back into her hands. "Elena's lawyers will put you under oath. They will ask you if I pass the standard auditory test on the day of my exam. If you say yes, they will demand an independent review, and you will go to federal prison for medical fraud. If you say no, she takes my son. I am willing to take that risk," Maya said fiercely. "I am not," Gideon fired back. He stepped away from her, putting physical distance between them. His broad shoulders were tense, his face hardening into the impenetrable mask of a Tier 1 operator shutting down all emotion. "I let this go too far," he said, his voice dropping to a flat, clinical monotone. "You are a clinical nurse, Maya. That's it. You are not part of this family. You are a liability I can't afford right now." The words hit the quiet kitchen like a physical blow. From the hallway, a small, terrified sob broke the silence. Sam was standing in the doorway, wearing his pajamas. His face was crumpled in devastation. The boy raised his small, trembling hands. He looked at his father and frantically signed, "Please, no, stay." Gideon looked at his son's hands. His own jaw trembled, a micro-expression of pure agony, but he immediately turned his head away. By looking away, he severed the communication. He made himself deaf again. Maya looked at the man she had come to deeply care for. She saw the lie in his rigid posture. She knew he was falling on his sword to protect her. "You can't fight a war by pushing away everyone who tries to hand you a shield, Gideon," Maya whispered. He didn't turn around. He couldn't hear her. With tears stinging her eyes, Maya picked up her coat, gave Sam one last heartbreaking look, and walked out the front door. The fluorescent lights of the state family courtroom hummed overhead. Maya sat on the wooden witness stand, her hands folded tightly in her lap. A few feet away, Elena sat next to her high-priced attorney. A faint, triumphant smile rested on Elena's lips. Gideon sat at the respondent's table. He wore his navy dress blues, the metals heavy on his chest. He looked like a statue carved from granite, his eyes locked straight ahead. Nurse Rostova, Elena's lawyer said, pacing in front of the stand, "You personally conducted the medical evaluation of Captain Cross on the 14th of this month. I will remind you that you are under penalty of perjury." Did the captain pass his auditory exam? The courtroom fell dead, silent. Maya looked at Gideon. He was watching the lawyer's lips, his jaw tight. If she said yes, she would lose her license, her career, and her freedom. If she said no, Gideon would lose Sam. Maya took a deep, trembling breath, preparing to destroy her own life. Captain Cross. Stop. Gideon stood up. His voice wasn't a shout, but the absolute command in his tone echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He didn't look at the lawyer. He didn't look at his ex-wife. He looked directly at the judge. Gideon reached into the breast pocket of his decorated uniform. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper and placed it on the defense table. "Your Honor," Gideon said, his voice steady. "That is my finalized medical discharge. As of 0800 this morning, I voluntarily surrendered my commission. I am no longer a Navy SEAL." Elena's smile instantly vanished. Her lawyer stepped back, completely derailed. "I have profound, irreversible hearing loss," Gideon continued, speaking clearly to the judge. But as he spoke, he raised his scarred hands. Maya gasped softly. Gideon was signing. His movements were slow but deliberate and perfect. "I was terrified that losing my career meant losing my son," Gideon said, signing every word simultaneously. "I forced a 10-year-old boy to be my ears. That was my failure. But the woman on that stand refused to let me fail." He turned, finally looking at Maya. "She didn't lie for me. She taught me how to communicate. She taught me how to be a father again." Gideon lowered his hands, holding Maya's gaze. "I may be deaf, Your Honor, but I am not unfit. And I will not let an innocent woman perjure herself to protect my pride." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Elena's trap was built on exposing a lie. By stepping into the light and telling the truth, Gideon had just shattered it to pieces. 2 weeks later, the afternoon sun filtered warmly through the blinds of room 3 at the clinical annex. This time, Sam was not sitting on the edge of his seat, scanning the room for threats. The 10-year-old boy was in the waiting area, slouched comfortably in a chair, entirely engrossed in a comic book. He was finally just a kid. Inside the exam room, Gideon Cross sat on the edge of the medical table. He wasn't wearing his dress blues. He wore a simple, faded gray sweater. The heavy aviator sunglasses were nowhere to be seen. He didn't need to hide anymore. Maya stood in front of him, holding a newly calibrated, military-grade amplification device. Because Gideon had finally submitted to a full medical evaluation, the Navy doctors had been able to fit him with a processor designed specifically for severe blast-induced nerve damage. "Hold still," Maya said, her lips moving clearly as she stepped into his space. Gideon didn't tense. He didn't pull away. He sat perfectly still as Maya gently placed the small device behind his left ear. Her cool fingers brushed against his jaw, and this time he leaned slightly into her touch, his eyes never leaving hers. Maya picked up her tablet and synced the frequency. She looked at him, raised her hand, and signed. "Ready?" Gideon nodded. "Ready?" Maya tapped the screen. For 2 years, Gideon's world had been a muffled, fading underwater echo. But suddenly, a sharp crackle of static broke the silence. Then the low, steady hum of the air conditioning vent overhead. Gideon's breath hitched in his chest. His hands gripped the edge of the table. Maya lowered the tablet. She didn't sign. She didn't exaggerate her lip movements. She just looked at him with soft, shining eyes and spoke in a quiet, normal volume. "Welcome back, Gideon." Gideon closed his eyes. The sound of her voice, warm, steady, and perfectly clear, washed over him like rain after a 10-year drought. A single tear escaped, tracking down his weathered cheek. He didn't bother wiping it away. He reached up, wrapping his large, scarred hand over hers where it still rested on his shoulder. In the courtroom, Gideon's voice was thick with emotion, rough but grounded. "You didn't let me finish." Maya smiled softly. "Finish what?" "Asking you to stay," Gideon said. He opened his eyes, looking at her, not as a soldier assessing a threat, but as a man looking at his future. "I don't need a nurse anymore, Maya, but I need you. We need you." Before Maya could answer, The door to the exam room burst open. "Dad!" Sam ran in, holding up his comic book. "Did it work? Can you hear?" Gideon turned. He heard the squeak of his son's sneakers on the linoleum. He heard the high, excited pitch of the boy's voice. Gideon dropped to one knee and caught his son in a massive embrace, burying his face in Sam's shoulder. Over the boy's head, he looked up at Maya. She wasn't leaving. The war was finally over, and for the first time in his life, the Tier 1 operator had found a home he didn't have to fight to protect.